Chapter 81. Gunsmith's Forge. The end of the prince's speech was the sign for them all to disperse and start making plans for what was going to come next. Dominic returned to his room to finish the mana revolvers. He knew that it was going to take him the rest of the day to finish them, but it would be a good backup for his new magic once he learned to actually use the pistols. Once all the inscription work was finished, Dominic faced a dilemma. If he used the usual method of sprinkling the weapon with mana core dust, it would use up a whole core to do the 2 pistols. That wasn't really resource efficient. So, he crushed an ogre core into a fresh bucket of the tempering oil potion and imbued it with as much mana as he could, then put the first heated pistol into the oil. Flames rose from the oil as the weapon was dunked, and the structure turned bright silver. Mana revolver, created at level 17, rare grade. Dominic assembled the fine parts for the trigger mechanism and then put the grips and the side covers back on the pistol before testing the mechanics. It dry-fired smoothly and cycled effortlessly. Perfect. The process was repeated with the second pistol after reloading the oil with mana, which took him nearly 10 minutes. Mana revolver, created at level 17, rare grade. Perfect. A matched pair of rare grade pistols. Being a sorcerer really was a cheat code for crafting. Dominic put the pistols in the storage ring around his toe and went to bed early, as Pops had warned him to. The breakfast meal was delivered at first dawn, an hour earlier than usual, and before it was even finished, there was a solitaire waiting at the door for Dominic. Apprentice, I am your escort for the morning. Each gunsmith will not go anywhere unattended, he announced in a dry monotone. Dominic gave Pops a confused look, but the old dwarf only shrugged helplessly. He wasn't in charge of increased security measures for the forge. If someone thought that the gunsmiths might be targeted, then they got a guard, and that was that. Dominic finished his meal and made sure that he had put the special oil into his storage space and put a bucket of regular oil out, in case someone went into his room. The chances of that seemed extremely low, but it was still better to be safe. Once he got to the gunsmith station, he would see if he could get materials to do the same, as they were expected to make higher-grade weapons. The guard wasn't leading Dominic to the forge, and he was becoming suspicious as they moved down into a basement level of the palace. Activating mage armor might cause issues, but Dominic was ready to cast the defensive spell at any moment. The escort didn't appear to care. He just led the way down through the palace until they reached a freshly renovated basement level that clearly used to be a dungeon, as Dominic could still see the manacle mounts on the walls and the outlines of the cell bars. But it had been equipped with forges for them, and there were journeymen there already preparing to work. Apprentice Dominic, this is your station. Materials are on their way. The instructions were to hold them in the storage area until each smith had arrived. The guard explained in a bored tone. A car was rolled out with an assortment of rare metals, mana cores, gems, and pre-made Magitech circuitry, mounted in wax sheets that could be melted to place the circuit on the weapon, presumably a rifle by the size. What are our instructions? I don't see a set blueprint to work from, so are we just making whatever sorts of rifles we feel like? Dominic asked. Do you have multiple rifle blueprints of your own? One of the other smiths sneered. Technically, one is a gun's word, and one is a rifle. But yes. Dominic replied with a shrug. One of the older journeymen gave the arrogant journeyman an annoyed look. They want uncommon quality or better, and at least 2 rifles per smith per day. How you get to that standard is up to you, but don't expect anyone to pick up your slack. That goes for the rest of you as well. He insisted. If they weren't going to share a blueprint to get uniform weapons for the regiment, then Dominic was free to make whatever he wanted, within his abilities. So, he could make the ogre hunting rifles, but he could also make the gun's word, which was nothing more than a long-barreled revolver mounted to the back of a sword blade. Those were much faster to create, and less complex. Plus, there was a chance that he could make the Magitech circuitry for a mana revolver work on them. Dominic looked over the pre-made circuitry prepared on the cart, and saw that indeed there were loops for the creation of mana bullets, the same as he had so painstakingly carved into every cylinder of the revolver. But when he looked around the room, everyone was making conventional firearms, mostly the steam rifles with pressurized backpacks that the riflemen of the officers' corps traditionally used. Dominic looked at the items around him and decided to ask one more question before he began. Are we making weapons for an all-rifleman unit, or do we also need pistols for gunslingers and sidearms? I also have a pistol recipe. A familiar deep voice replied, and the old armorer, who traditionally sat in the corner of the forge engraving armor, entered. The unit is all riflemen. You can make pistols after you finish your daily rifles if you want the extra military credits, but they're not the primary weapon of the Natural Sons. They will be placed behind the main lines so they can exercise their longer range. Dominic bowed in recognition of the old armorer's knowledge and skill, and then began to arrange his tools to make ogre-slaying rifles. Or, at least a mass-produced knockoff based on the design. There were plenty of mana cores here, so he wasn't lacking in resources, but Dominic wasn't naive enough to think that the bare minimum of 2 rifles a day was going to be anywhere near enough. That was more of the standard to avoid punishment, not to measure success. Chapter 82. Mass-produced. Dominic considered how he could accelerate the manufacturing process. If he didn't do a wooden gun and used a metallic shell with a leather back pad, it would save him at least 15 minutes per rifle. That was a good start. They also had pre-made rifle barrels, forged and machine-milled with standardized rifling, and an octagonal exterior. If he cast the receiver and used the provided pressure canisters, he could save another 15 minutes. At that point, he would be rushing through the whole thing in an hour, with no sense of finesse. Just enough time to check tolerances and file things roughly flat, the way he had for the first batch. They were not works of art, but they had been produced on a very limited timeline. Of course, so were these ones, as the attack had most likely already started. The faster they sent rifles to the training grounds and front lines, the more lives they could save. Dominic got to work heating metal and bending tubing for the pressure release and charging mechanisms. He took a bit more time than usual with the trim pieces, and at least brought the exteriors to a smooth surface before stamping a dragon in flight on both sides of the metal butt shell to hide the imperfections. Making them in all metal left Dominic with a bit more surface to alter, so for the first rifle, he added a checkered pattern to the guard under the barrel, making it easier to grip when wet. They even had sights pre-made for the rifles, a standard front post and sliding rear sight style. Much prettier than the notched plate version that the original design had called for, and adjustable for distance. It almost felt like he was in a factory, slapping together pieces of a product, and not a smithy. Sure, he needed to make the base frame and add all the Magitech circuitry, but they had parts of that pre-made as well. The cast frame and receiver combinations were ready after 3 hours, but by then, he had the rest of the 10 rifles assembled. With so many pre-made parts, Dominic just had to pick the ones he needed. However, he could hear the other gunsmiths laughing at him as he worked. They were using 1 or 2 stock parts for their rifles, mostly barrels. The rest of the parts were custom-made as they went. Dominic happily milled the receivers and ground everything perfect before he started on the loading mechanism, which was specific to the ogre hunting rifle. That took nearly as long as the rest of the rifle had. But when the sound of maids coming their way signaled lunch, he had all 10 of them assembled and heated, ready for an oil bath enchantment. He had used one of the cores they provided, a level 10 mana core of indeterminate origin. Ground into his oil and loaded with mana, the first rifle went in, and then came back out sleek black as the magic activated. Ogre Hunting Rifle Level 10, Uncommon Quality. Then another went into the oil bath after a half-minute for him to recharge the mana. Ogre Hunting Rifle Level 10, Uncommon Quality. Over and over, Dominic charged the oil and dunked the rifles, then hung them to let any remaining oil drip out of their workings before he mounted the leather butt pads. The old armorer walked to Dominic's station and stared at the rifles with admiration. 10 rifles by lunch, all uncommon. No failures, no flawed successes. Not bad for an apprentice. He grumbled, but Dominic could tell that it was more of a jab at the other smiths than praise for him. The journeyman beside Dominic stared at the rifles. But where is the sense of class? The pride in creation that a Magitech weapon should have? No matter how I look at them, they're nothing more than uncommon rifles for common soldiers. Dominic nodded in agreement. Did we need to make them pretty? I can make 2 rare rifles this afternoon up to a much fancier standard, with some of the rare materials, if that's what we need. He asked the old armorer. The grumpy old man chuckled. Let the others make those. At this rate, you'll be arming a unit a day, while they arm the commanders. Then the old man walked to the lunch cart, ignoring the outrage. But that was nothing compared to the outrage when General Merlot came in to collect Dominic's creations and hung a chalkboard on the wall with a total weapon count on the wall. 10 uncommon for Dominic, 1 uncommon rifle each for 3 of the 20 other gunsmiths. It was so insanely lopsided that the rest of the group, who had been hoping to impress with rare rifles, keenly felt the bite. If their creation failed to meet the standard, they would be struggling to make 2 uncommon, or an uncommon and a rare, on the first day. Dominic got another batch of receivers and frames cooling in the sand casting table, then went to get lunch. Slowly, the others came over, and the snobbish journeyman decided it was a good chance to taunt Dominic again. "Don't you have any pride in your work?" he asked. "Of course I do. I even stamped my signature dragon on the gun butts. When the soldiers put their hands on it, they'll know it's one of mine at a glance. I double braze all my joints and I extended the braces, so even the roughest of treatment won't damage the pressure tubing. Those rifles should be reliable through an entire war, and then some. In the woods, the hunters wrap their Magitech rifles with cloth so that the metal doesn't reflect the light and spook the animals. When you're actually using a weapon, nobody cares what it looks like. Pretty is for formations and formal events." The other gunsmiths listened to Dominic's response with great amusement. The new apprentice was putting the journeyman in his place, and he had already shown that he had the skills to back up his boasting. "What do you even know about how things are in battle, apprentice?" The journeyman sneered, trying to salvage his argument. Dominic gestured to the royal guard at the door. "No need to take my word for it. All of the royal guards were gathered when we got our rewards." The guard smiled. 608 confirmed kills for the royal sorcerer. "I dare say that he has more military merits than every other craftsman in the room combined, excluding the master smith. He was even given an official title for his military accomplishments." That shut the journeyman up. Chapter 83. Simple but precise. They finished lunch in silence, and Dominic went back to his work, assembling the basics for another 10 rifles while the castings for the other parts cooled. Once he started milling the parts and tapping the threads, Dominic noticed that the guards were watching over his shoulder. "That's such a simple mechanism. How does that even become a Magitech weapon?" one of them asked curiously. "It really is insanely simple, especially compared to the steam rifles. It's all in the Magitech circuits. If you can't use the mana to charge the circuit, it's just an air rifle. Nothing special, but the Magitech circuits here connect to the expansion chamber and imbue the bullets with the magical effects. That's why I chose this design. To arm an entire regiment takes hundreds of weapons, and I can do these in bulk with only a half-dozen holes to be drilled and the air lines to connect. Even the valves are pre-made for us." As the other gunsmith said, there are 2 levels to this art: true art and mass-produced reliable trash. The second is what I am making, but that doesn't mean they won't work. In fact, because they're so simple, they're nearly impossible to destroy without crushing them. There are only 2 external mechanisms, and that's just the levers. If you break the charging lever off, you can weld a new one on in seconds, or even just jam the cleaning rod in the broken arm's mounting hole and use it as a lever. That made the guard laugh. "You know, someone is going to actually do that, right?" Dominic nodded. "If it breaks off cleanly, or you can extract the stub, the bolt hole is just large enough for the cleaning rod. I give it 2 weeks before someone realizes that in the field." A few of the other smiths chuckled as they realized that the blueprint for this rifle was absolutely brilliant. Whoever had designed it was a true friend to the soldiers, so they suspected that it might be the work of a commoner-born master gunsmith or technomage. It was also carefully designed so that the bedding of the action could be done only on the desired raised points, without accidentally hard-mounting a critical stress relief area. Dominic simply poured the spoon of epoxy into the 2 notches, and then added a dab to the bolt holes when he mounted the action. It would cure fully overnight, and while it might not make the most accurate long-range rifle, it would be good enough at anything under 300 meters. One of the other gunsmiths looked at Dominic's work and tapped his chin. "This is a rare recipe, isn't it? But it needs an entire higher-level core per rifle to meet the rare item standard, right?" he asked. Dominic nodded. With a level 19 or 20 mana core from an ogre, it will certainly be rare quality. But we don't have any of those in the supplies today. Level 10 isn't half bad, though, and I don't use up the core with every creation this way. They're reliably coming out as uncommon, and that's the standard that was requested. The other gunsmiths thought about that answer. The sorcerer was right. He was doing exactly what they were requested to, and doing it faster than anyone else. He didn't hold on to the pride of craftsmanship that a normal artisan would. He just slapped out something functional and called it ready for deployment. The mere thought of that pained the others, but they understood his point. Given the option, the soldiers would rather have a mediocre quality, plain-looking weapon right now than an outstanding 1-3 battles from now. Alright, let him keep doing it that way. The army wants rifles, and he's making rifles. Now, I won't insult my own name as a crafter to do the same, but I will endeavor to turn out larger quantities of passable quality pieces. One of the smiths reluctantly agreed. The others didn't say anything, and a few gave him disgusted looks for compromising and making anything less than a masterpiece every time. But when they got back to their workstations, Dominic couldn't help but notice that the pace had notably increased, even among those who already had one rifle produced for the day. He also noticed that the next cart full of supplies were in sizes much closer to what he needed, limiting the wasted time altering them. This supply must have come from the Royal Army's spare parts and repair materials department, the same source that had stocked his forge when he went out with Princess Alexis and the reservists. He never had a chance to meet any of the people who worked in that department, as they were at the far end of the forge complex, in another building. But they would be working overtime to restock what the smiths were using, as well as what was being shipped out with the army. The assistants brought over a second sand table for Dominic to forge the rough parts in larger quantities. So, he finished the second batch and then set up the tooling for another 20 to be finished the next day. As he finished up the last of his second batch and screwed the layered leather but pads on before test firing them without ammunition, Dominic mentally calculated how long he would need to finish the same number of rifles tomorrow. If he drilled all 20 receivers one after another, they would go much more quickly. Do the same hole on each, so he didn't need to change tooling, and he could prep a whole day's work in the first few hours of the shift. You seem like you're deeply lost in thought for someone who is 16 rifles ahead of the next gunsmith. The man on Dominic's left joked. Dominic smiled back at him. I was planning how to approach tomorrow. When these have cooled enough to be worked, I can prep them all in the morning and then just go part by part and assemble at the end. It should go more smoothly than today, as I will only have to switch tools every 20 repetitions. Efficient. You know, that's not a bad idea. Instead of making a third, I will prep the hardest parts for tomorrow and guarantee that I have enough time to finish. He agreed. The first day's performance surely wasn't going to negatively change the palace's opinion of them if they could pick up their pace in the following days with a bit of prep work. Chapter 84. Pre-made parts. The next morning, Dominic went straight to work milling the parts for his rifles that weren't standardized and provided on the cart. He was immensely grateful that they didn't need to make their own barrels, as that alone would take multiple days for 20 rifles, not to mention all the different metals needed for the trigger actions they were provided. Unless they greatly increased the size of his forge and gave him the specialized tools needed for barrel making, that was. This morning, Dominic noticed that the loading levers, a hinged action that covered the trigger, had been stacked on his cart. He had made them yesterday, but someone must have tasked another forge worker to make an entire box full of them for him last night. That was one less part to deal with, other than the single hole he needed to drill in them for mounting. If they kept this up, his job would be more like a precision fitment worker than a gunsmith. But yesterday it took him a little over 17 hours to assemble 20, and 3 hours into the day, using Magitech tools, he had the receivers for 20 more ready and a jig built to hold them in place, while precision guiding each hole. Another 4 hours to grind threads for bolts, shape and fit all the parts that were on his cart, and he was ready to start assembly. The other smiths had gained many new parts for their builds, but Dominic did notice that many of the gunsmiths disdained them and preferred to use only parts that they hand-made themselves. The old armorer came over to see how Dominic was doing, and he flagged him down to ask a question. Where are all these parts coming from? The royal forges aren't that large. Dominic asked quietly. There are 2 factories in the city dedicated to nothing but making rifle parts for the royal gunsmiths. They have 100 men working 3 shifts a day. At that rate, they're producing far more parts than we need, but they will switch to another project in a month or 2, once there is enough stockpile to cover the expected use for the year. The armorer explained. Well, that made more sense. You know, if we sent them one of these and they duplicated it for me, I could save a few hours a day. Dominic joked. The old man chuckled. No, there's only so much the king is willing to outsource to a factory. Besides, it all needs to come here anyhow, as without an appropriate trade skill core, it's impossible to activate any of the enchantments. Dominic gave him a curious look, and the old man shook his head. It's impossible for a regular human to activate any of the enchantments. Maybe a sorcerer with no skill core can just draw a new Magitech circuit and expect it to work with a touch of mana, but it doesn't work that way for most of us. Dominic shrugged at the explanation. Magitech was basically science, but with mana. Making it work wasn't all that hard in his experience. Dominic spent close to 3 hours assembling and testing the clearances of the 20 rifles, then began to do the enchantment. Each was carefully hung to dry, freshly matte black from the enchanting process, which allowed Dominic to prepare his parts for the next morning again. It was somewhat amusing to look at the other workbenches, with their carefully arranged tools, and then his own, with 10 different drills, 3 sizes of thread taps, and a complex framework built over the bench. It looked like he lived in chaos, but when he went home only 12 hours into the day, his duties done, there were many envious glares. But on the 3rd day, his chaotic-looking workbench wasn't alone. 4 more of the benches had a jig and tooling frame built to speed up their work. But even better, someone had found him a new router and a Magitech lathe. The Magitech tools had a precise guide for depth and travel, which allowed Dominic to do the majority of the milling work in under 5 minutes per rifle, instead of doing it all by hand with a rasp, or heat and a hammer. On the 3rd day, he didn't even start assembling a single rifle for the first 12 hours. He just mass-produced parts. Now that he had multiple days' worth of them, he only had to do the assembly and enchanting. It made for a long day, but he only had to assemble rifles for the next few days, and that was a 10-minute process if you ignored the drying and curing time. His luck wasn't going to be that good, as Dominic realized the next day at 10 in the morning, when he had assembled 20 rifles from parts and was preparing to enchant them. You're not expecting to just knock out 20 rifles and leave before noon, are you, Apprentice Dominic? The old armorer asked. Of course not, Master Smith. Once I finish these, I'll make some more parts. The old smith simply waited with the same disapproving look on his face until Dominic relented. I'll finish another batch and then make some more parts? Dominic tried. That's better. Everyone in the forge is working close to 16 hours a day. We can't be having the apprentice going home early every day. It looks bad on the gunsmiths. Dominic sighed. If the others weren't so picky, they could be turning out more than 2 rifles a day and going home at a reasonable hour. Fortunately, precision milling was a relaxing pastime for Dominic, and the satisfaction of seeing his pile of parts refill was immense. If it wasn't, he would have to rearrange his day because assembling 2 batches of rifles and oil bath enchanting them only took half the time that the others were expecting to be at work for. With practice, the parts moved smoothly through the lathe and router stations, moving from box to box, so Dominic knew how many were left to mill for the next batch. He finished all the materials he had before the end of the day, and then returned to his room, where Pops was waiting with freshly delivered late-night food. I hear that you're doing well in the rifle forges. Pops greeted him. Mass production wins every time. I've got a pretty good system down now. Dominic agreed. The old dwarf chuckled. They sent 50 of your rifles to the training grounds today for the new regiment to train on. The way they're going, I suspect the entire new regiment will be using your rifles, and the rest will be going to restock the officers of the other units. I don't know what you've been doing over there, but I filled all the tooling and equipment requests that they made. Hopefully, they're working out for you. You made the new lathe and router? They're wonderful. They turn an hour-and-a-half process into under 30 minutes a rifle. I've got enough parts stocked now to keep up the pace for weeks, but you know how it is. Can't go home early, or everyone will think that we're slacking and not taking our jobs seriously. But the regiment is only so large. Eventually, we're going to have more rifles than men trained on them. Dominic joked. Chapter 85. Still counts as one. The process repeated for the next 2 weeks, with Dominic making 40 rifles every day, then milling parts to keep his stockpile up. That was when they got their first visitors since the gunsmiths had been sequestered. The Crown Prince, Claudius. He arrived along with his royal retinue of 4 advisors and 20 royal guards, filling the gunsmith's forge. They stopped at the bottom of the stairs, and the prince looked around as the gunsmiths pretended to ignore his presence and keep working. All except Dominic, who had hearing protection on as he worked the router, milling receivers for the next few days' production. He was facing the wall and moving through the metal blocks with practiced smoothness. Your Highness, it is an honor to have you here. What brings you all the way down to the gunsmith's forge? The guard at the door asked. We have fully equipped the Natural Sons Regiment. 500 matched rifles, with spares for deployment. My younger cousin, who is in charge of equipping the regiment, noted that all the rifles they were given came from a single gunsmith's forge. That made me curious how you were doing things here, but I don't see a factory assembly line, with one master smith doing all the enchanting. He explained. You see, we have a 2-tier process going here. Most of the journeymen and mastersmiths are making traditional pieces for the regular army officers. The rifles for the Natural Sons were all provided by apprentice Dominic.
He's a bit of an odd one.
None of the flair for the artistic that you would expect, but he's got an efficient setup going there which turns out rifles like toys off a factory line. The prince could see Dominic working, though not exactly what he was doing, as his body was in the way. Yes, I recognize the practice from the hinge makers. Their men move through the process at their station the same way, with their mind on autopilot. Does he assemble and enchant the rifles himself, or just stamp his mark in the parts?
Prince Claudius asked.
He completes the entire process. He has been assembling and enchanting 40 rifles every morning, then making the custom parts that we can't order in for the rest of his shift. With the help of the master weaponsmith, they've managed to get him everything he needs to only make the last few critical components himself. Even the rifle stocks were changed to wooden ones last week to save metal. And they come shaped to his blueprint, so he only has to bolt the parts to them. It's a bit of a pain, as the metal frames were less of a headache to work with during the enchanting process, but it's much faster than making them himself. The prince smiled at the chatty guard. He had answered every question that the prince had without raising any suspicions at all. It really was the royal sorcerer who was making all those rifles on his own. There were many in the royal palace who had been curious about the sheer number of matched weapons that were coming out of the gunsmith's forge. Asking artisans to share their precious blueprints was akin to asking them to share their favorite daughter around, yet suddenly, there were so many weapons in a new design coming out of the forge. None of the nobles would have believed it was one gunsmith's work if he had not seen it himself. So, the apprentice has turned out more rifles than the rest of the forge combined? The prince asked carefully. The guard, who coincidentally was the one who escorted Dominic to and from work every day, smiled.
The
royal sorcerer has turned out more rifles than the rest of the forge. And he uses fewer rare materials. See that long vat of shimmering oil? It's got crushed mana cores in it, and he only has to add new mana core dust every few days. Most of the plans require a core for every rifle to guarantee uncommon quality or better rifles. But he can do some magic thing to the oil, and just keep succeeding. It's really quite remarkable. Whoever recommended him for this spot deserves recognition for their foresight. The prince nodded in agreement, then went to speak with Dominic, who finished one last item, and then swapped the full and empty boxes before turning around and removing his ear coverings. Your Highness, my apologies, I didn't hear you enter. Welcome to the gunsmith's forge. He greeted. The prince looked at the trade skill core on Dominic's wrist, which was bright gold with streaks of blue, marking his progress as 2/3 of the way through the apprentice ranks. Royal Sorcerer, on behalf of the Natural Sons Regiment, I commend your hard work. But I have a request. Might I see the process that goes into enchanting one of these rifles? Not the full production, as I understand that takes significant time, but your unique enchanting process. The Crown Prince asked. Dominic shrugged. Certainly. Outwardly, it looks much like the standard mana oil bath enchanting that is done in all the forges. But as a sorcerer, I have some advantages. There is mana core dust in my oil, and I top off the mana between uses. So, if you will allow me a few minutes to assemble a rifle, I can show you. The prince nodded, and Dominic assembled a rifle, taking a bit of extra time to ensure that everything was perfect. Then, he hung it over the forge for a few minutes, heating the metal, while he prepped the epoxy bedding on the wooden stock. Once the metal was hot, he assembled the rifle with thick gloves on and tightened the 2 bolts that held the wood to the metal assembly, then dunked it in the oil and finished the process with a touch more mana before removing the rifle and wiping away the excess oil. When that is dry and cured, it will be ready to use. As it is, the epoxy needs to cure and the wooden stock is still wet with oil, though I've wiped it down. But it's fully enchanted, Dominic explained. How long before that rifle is ready for use? The Crown Prince asked. I normally ship them out in the late afternoon. 4 hours is close to the minimum, though in theory they should be ready in half an hour after I finish. The prince made a motion, and one of the guards slipped his gloves on and angled the rifle for better viewing. Uncommon quality, level 10. The same as all the others. Thank you, Royal Sorcerer. You have enlightened me today. The prince announced, then turned and left. Dominic turned to look at the old smith. This one counts for tomorrow. Don't go giving them ideas about me being able to make more than I am. Chapter 86. Seeing Through the Veil. Dominic put the spare rifle in his storage cube and went back to milling the parts for tomorrow's orders. So far, everything appeared to be going well, and if they had finished arming the regiment, then the front lines would soon be getting a reliable increase in firepower. On the other side of the palace, the Crown Prince strode into a meeting with purpose, not even caring that the door slammed open to announce his presence before the attendant was able to. Father, I have the information you requested. It is the sorcerer making the rifles on his own. As you suspected, he has no issues comprehending magical blueprints. He just looks at them and makes the parts like any other common tool, except these are meant for war. He announced. The king's advisors turned to him in shock. You mean he can turn out Magitech rifles as if they were shovels? The defense minister asked, but everyone simply ignored him as the king and his oldest son stared each other down. After a few tense seconds, the king sighed. That's what I was afraid of. The veil doesn't apply to dragons and their ilk. Magic is no different from math to them, and they will not fail if they follow the steps properly. The others in the room looked horrified, but in the back, the twin princesses smirked at each other. They had been wagering on this fact since Dominic had produced 10 rifles from spare parts in only a few days. They might not have been the highest quality weapons ever produced, but the magical power on them was reliable and uniform. In his hands, craftsmanship meant nothing until it was so bad that the weapon failed. But when a human artificer tried to produce a Magitech weapon, every hand movement, every adjustment, every imperfection on the parts added up to the outcome. If they tried to just throw parts together and dunk them in mana oil, they would more likely burn the forge down than make a fully capable Magitech weapon. What do we do about it? The defense minister tried again. Well, he works for us, does he not? There was a reason that the sorcerer put in so much work to try to gain an apprentice's position. Does anyone know what he wanted to ask of the crown? The king asked. Princess Alexis cleared her throat, and her father spun in his seat. He was born in a Wavemates border village that was burned to the ground about a decade ago. He wants vengeance, and to bring the region under Signia's control. She explained. A sorcerer with nationalist sentiment. One of the nobles scoffed. The crown prince chuckled, and the twins smirked at each other. Before they could speak, the crown prince did. I suspect that nationalism has nothing to do with it. His village was on the Wavemate side of the border. However, he doesn't know the names or identities of the soldiers who burned his village to the ground. So, he's willing to turn out mass-produced Magitech weapons until every soldier who might have been at the massacre of his village is dead. It's not nationalism, it's vengeance. The dragons might pretend that their actions are driven by some noble sentiment about maintaining stability, order, or some other nonsense. But when you anger a dragon, they burn everything to the ground. It's in their nature. A dragonkin sorcerer just has a bit more patience. Dominic didn't really strike the princess as the vengeful sort, but when they were under attack, he certainly didn't cower in fear. The king looked at the deployment map on the large table. 10 years ago, at the former Wavemates border? Is that not here? The crown prince nodded.
Yes.
We took it in the first week during an encircling action to force the Dago's army to go the long way around the river valley. It is now back under Signia's control, but nobody lives there. The whole area is barren and abandoned. It hasn't been occupied since the fall of the Wavemates kingdom. The agriculture minister gestured to the location. It's actually been 12 years since the farms there were raised, and the army reports that Dagos never sent new farmers to work the area after killing the residents. Everything is fully overgrown, and no attempt has been made to clear the area. They even found skeletal human remains in some of the residences, as well as 3 different battle locations. But the manor house still stands. The army received supplies there this week, and they have a battalion stationed in the manor for defense of the region. The king of Signia sighed. It seemed that nobody in the Dagos nobility had actually cared about that land after the lord working it had passed. Who was responsible for it before it was raised? One of the younger ministers asked. The king cleared his throat. It was a cold palace for one of the Wavemates regent's imperial concubines and her family. When she lost favor, she was exiled to the border with her staff and later brought her brother to her manor after his branch of the family also fell from favor. I believe that most of you knew the Earl, second cousin to King Wavemates. That made sense to the other nobles. It belonged to the crown, and as nobody was using it and nobody was sent to retake it, the property was forgotten by both sides of the conflict. The crown prince looked at the map with consternation clear on his face. They went to all that trouble to raise the farms, kill the townsfolk and even the rural peasants, but left the manor intact after killing the concubine's family? That doesn't make sense. Nobody kills off the peasants without a good reason. He noted. Princess Alexis chuckled grimly. They do if the residents aren't human. The concubine was a techno-witch, her brothers were all dragonkin mages of questionable lineage, and most of the locals were as well. In fact, the apprentice you were investigating today was apparently born to a member of the concubine's family, though our records say that his mother worked as an arcanist, not a techno-witch. The crown prince looked startled that she had looked that far into the apprentice's records, but realized that they had fought together, so the sorcerer had likely provided much of that information himself. None of them knew that she had seen him clearly healing from fatal injuries with draconic magic. Chapter 87. Lineage Matters. Might I know why the lineage of a gunsmith matters? One of the nobles in the strategy meeting asked. Because he turned out 500 uncommon rifles for the army, without a single failure. But more importantly, he might be able to innovate new recipes on his own. His accomplishment for the war effort has been nearly 20 times the required rate, and the merits that he has accumulated will certainly be called in soon. If he happens to have foreign noble or royal blood, it will be of vital importance to our future decisions. The king retorted, as if the man was an idiot. Princess Alexis smiled softly to herself. Dominic likely didn't even know how many royal merits he had accumulated, or what they could be used for. If he did, he would have made a request by now, even if it was for additional days off in exchange for his excess production. We will discuss this later. For now, we need to shift the Natural Sons Regiment into position at the border. I want them mounted on mechanical cavalry for rapid deployment as a ranged cavalry rifles unit. See that they are prepared by morning. The king decided. Late that night, Dominic finished his work and returned to his room to find a fresh dinner plate and a note waiting for him. Your hometown has been retaken by the army. Pa. Dominic smiled. They certainly hadn't done it for him, but it didn't change the fact that he had seen a bit of vengeance done. The next morning, the guard picked him up as usual, but led him down a different route than usual. Did you forget something in your room? Dominic asked as they rounded an unfamiliar corner. The guard chuckled. Not at all. Your workstation has been moved. You will get further instructions once you are there. Now that they had reached their goal and had a few dozen extra rifles, Dominic assumed that the army had no more need for him to continue at that pace, but he had nearly 100 more rifles worth of parts waiting for him to finish them. As soldiers fell and weapons took damage, they would need the replacements, and there wasn't anyone else in the gunsmith's forge who could do it. They didn't have any blueprints for the rifles he had been making. The room that Dominic was led to was indeed a forge, though it appeared to be in a suite much like Pop's room. He could even see the presumably unused bedroom next to it. But the room wasn't empty, as there were 2 older, gray-haired women in plain dresses and 1 preteen boy waiting there for him, along with all of the tooling and jigs that he had prepared for the rifles. So, perhaps he wasn't stopping the production but doing it in private? That could mean that they wanted some higher quality weapons out of him, but didn't want to advertise it to the other gunsmiths. But the presence of these 2 random women was confusing him. Royal Sorcerer Dominic, meet Lady Camilla. She was the governess for the twin princesses, and now she will be tutoring you in courtly manners and regulations until such time as she deems that you have grasped the fundamentals. Beside her is Miss Lucy, who will be tutoring you in arcane engineering for the foreseeable future. After your lessons each day, the Crown has requested that you continue to assemble a minimum of 5 rifles per day to keep up with replacements and demand. All of your spare parts have been brought, and you may arrange your schedule as you see fit. The rooms here are vacant, so if your day runs overly long, the guard on duty will call for your meals, and you may remain in this suite. Dominic nodded, and Lady Camilla smiled. It seems that the young sorcerer has learned the most important part of noble etiquette. Not interrupting with questions. Perhaps this will be easier than I was led to believe. Young Miss Alexis had implied that he might share some of her personality traits. Dominic smiled and refrained from laughing. He could see how a matched pair of battle-obsessed princesses might have driven their governess to drinking. Once they were finished speaking, Dominic bowed politely to the 2 women. Tutors, it is a pleasure to meet you both. Please excuse the mess. The tools of my trade do take up a rather significant portion of the room. Lady Camilla nodded in response, while Miss Lucy just shrugged. It will only get more cluttered in here, which is why you will be learning here and not in your own suite. We were informed, in no uncertain terms, that your master will not accept the movement of all necessary tools into the shared suite. She explained. Dominic would have paid good money to be there when they asked, though. No way was Pops going to surrender half his suite to a gunsmith's forge and an arcane engineering lab. Dominic didn't know what tools that was going to need, but the trade was unlikely to be less space-intensive than the gunsmith's forge was. The guard retreated to the door, and Dominic turned to the young boy, who was still standing silently in the corner of the room. "And who might this be?" he asked. "That is Miss Lucy's grandson. He will be on his best behavior as he observes today's lessons to determine if a career as a tutor is well suited to his personality." Lady Camilla explained, with a sharp look at the boy. Dominic understood. Chances are the boy made a fuss about whatever career path his parents had chosen for him, so he was being subtly punished by needing to stand in the corner of a room and watch others teach all day. There was no chair where he was stationed, and leaning against the wall would only give so much relief from the strain, unless he was sent to run errands or fetch items. Lady Camilla brought out a textbook and placed it on the table, facing Dominic. "Now let us get started. How many years did you study this tome during your youth?"
she asked.
Dominic looked at it, and then brought out a book of his own, salvaged from the ruins of his home. "Tutor, this is the etiquette book that I studied as a youth," he explained. His version was much smaller and definitely less fancy than hers. It was also written to be a children's introductory primer or a crash course for a commoner elevated to a barony, not a comprehensive etiquette guide for the royal family themselves. So, it covered important things like proper table settings, greeting guests, and how to turn down requests without insult, but didn't cover much royal etiquette or anything on international relations or trade policy. Dominic was bad at that part. The turning down requests, it was so rare that people asked him for things that he just instinctively said yes, even when he knew that it was going to be troublesome. But sometimes that worked out well for him. Not long ago, when he was moving through Dagos on his way to Signia, he had nearly been caught and interrogated by a military patrol. He was saved when a merchant, whose watch he had repaired for free, hid him in a false bottom of one of the wagons. Chapter 88. Etiquette Hell Week. That was the first day of what Dominic would later not so fondly refer to as Hell Week. The first week of his training to be a proper royal sorcerer, as the tutor described it. Compared to the etiquette and history lessons, the introduction to arcane engineering was positively sublime. However, Miss Lucy did everything by the book, and if Dominic should dare to skip steps or take shortcuts on simple devices, she would insist that he started over. The fact that it worked, and that he already knew this much as a child, was not relevant to her lesson plan. She was pleasant enough about it, but very protective of her craft, the same way that the other gunsmiths wouldn't even consider a process like the one that he was using. After a full week of the introductory basics, which Dominic moved through with ease, things were starting to look up, and the material was beginning to cover a few things that he didn't already understand. But that was when they ran into the first clash between Dominic's understanding of magic and the arcane engineering textbook. Tutor Lucy, why does this activation circuit use a variable output resistor when the effect is an on-off function? He asked. Pardon. These circuits, they exist to vary the output of the spell effect. Increasing the power in stages activates more of them, to a total of 10 stages. But that's not appropriate for a door lock. You only need one, as the state is either locked or unlocked, and the other 9 are redundant. Miss Lucy looked at the circuit that he was describing and noticed that he was correct. But all Magitech locks were standardized. Only the most complex used a magical key and 9 damage circuits, so that only the correct key would open the door, even if it activated the mechanical lock. But that was a lesson much later in the textbook. The tutor pinched the bridge of her nose and admitted to herself that the student knew much more than he logically should. It is a standardized design so that any Magitech lock can be upgraded with a magical key. The key is attuned to one of the circuits, and the others are damaged by the locksmith, so that only the proper key will work, even if someone duplicates the physical key shape. It makes the lock exceedingly difficult to pick, and it is viewed as the pinnacle of Magitech security. Only the most advanced of locksmiths can open them. She replied with a hint of pride in her tone. Dominic looked at the Magitech circuit and frowned. You have an alternate idea? She asked, and then set a lock on the table, designed for a magical key. Dominic looked it over for a second, and then grabbed a small etching pick from his smith's tools. A quick slide and wiggle of the pick, and then a burst of mana to the hasp of the lock, and it simply fell open.
How?
The shocked tutor asked. A trained mage, or someone like myself, can apply mana to the other side of the circuit and bypass the process entirely, or simply flood it with mana until it activates. But if I close it again, it's securely locked, as if nothing ever happened, no damage to the lock itself. Dominic replied, as he manipulated it in his hands, then showed her that it was locked again. Lucy stared at the confused dragonkin with increasing unease. That was not how a Magitech circuit was supposed to work. It was only designed to accept mana from one point at the start. Without matching the magical signature, the circuit should have remained open and the lock immobile. Flipping the switch from the other side of the circuit should not be possible. Do you routinely open magic locks, Apprentice Dominic?
She asked.
Why would I need to? Nobody tries to lock me out of anything that I want to be in. There isn't even a lock on the door to my suite, much less a magical one. We just have gossiping maids, which are way more reliable at finding and preventing intruders anyhow.
That made the tutor smile fondly.
Once upon a time, she had been one of those gossiping palace maids. Then she was chosen as a concubine by a viscount, and now she was an esteemed royal tutor, as well as a journeyman arcane engineer. All right, let us move on with the lesson. The tutor insisted. Dominic decided that it was best to ignore redundant parts in the demonstration circuits. They were almost certainly designed by whoever had made the first blueprint, and then just faithfully copied by every artisan afterwards. Arcane engineering was the core of Magitech development, but the creation of new devices was not a fast process, and it was rare that a new device was produced which wasn't a combination of multiple existing devices with minor modifications. Even the Magitech vehicles mostly all used the same set of circuits, if they weren't powered by coal or liquid fuel boilers. They were still going over the most basics of the basics, but Dominic had read ahead in the book, and soon she would be getting into the interesting sorts of Magitech devices. He didn't have the specialized trade skill core that would impart him the knowledge that was needed to really master the craft, but from speaking with Pops, it was clear that some level of magitech comprehension was included and necessary for the blacksmiths to become a master. If he could build on that, he could pick up the second specialty as part of his existing skill and not need to destroy his hard work as a blacksmith and start over with a magitech engineer's trade skill core. Once the tutors were finished their lessons for the day, Dominic spent a few hours assembling rifles to the usual standard and then finished one more using the much higher level oil bath in his storage cube. Ogre Slaying Rifle, Uncommon Quality. Created at level 20. Twice the enhancement of the other rifles, thanks to the oil bath, but still uncommon if he didn't use Dragon Flame or an entire mana core to improve the work. Chapter 89. Like being back in school. Every night, Dominic made one improved rifle as he listened to the palace maids gossip about the news of the war. The room he was working in was right next to the courtyard where they took their breaks on days with favorable weather, and the main kitchen was on the other side of the courtyard. If he wasn't making too much noise, he could pick up most of the day's gossip, but most of it was hardly considered good news. While the portion of land where his home had been was recovered, and now under the control of the Signia army, large portions of the border had been lost, with the defenders driven back to the next manor house. There were rumors that the Dago's army had some new super weapon that the Signia forces were having trouble dealing with, but palace gossip could only be trusted so far, and the army was not sending any letters back. It was a sensible restriction during these early phases where the enemy didn't know all their positions and the royals hadn't had time to weed out all the likely spies from among their ranks, but it did lead to some truly wild rumors. For example, the one that said Prince Claudius had eliminated an entire company of soldiers by himself. There was no way that the Crown Prince was traveling anywhere alone, and Dominic had seen him only a week and a bit ago, so he was most likely not even on the battlefield right now. The next day would be a day off again, his lone day off every week. But Dominic didn't really have any plans, other than relaxing and letting his mind wander after another full week of having it crammed full of knowledge. He didn't know that there were so many rules, regulations, courtesies, and unspoken norms that the Signia nobles had to follow. But now he knew that they not only existed, but that they were different between every single rank of noblemen. No wonder they all seemed so uptight. They were just trying to remember the rules and not offend anyone. Out of habit, he was still awake and out of bed at first light to have breakfast with Pops, who was also off for the day, while one of the other smiths supervised the forge. The workers cycled their days off so that there weren't too many of them out on any given day. But because they were contractually master and apprentice, Pops and Dominic got their days off at the same time. You should head out into the city. Get some time away from the palace. You've got fancy clothes now, or you can wear your palace apprentice uniform and nobody would turn you away from their shops this time. You might even find a few interesting pieces to purchase and add to your collection. Pops suggested. That wasn't a bad choice. He had a few spells in his spellbook now, so it wasn't quite as urgent to go looking for magic. But there were so many wonderful magitech items available, and he definitely wanted to see what the capital city had been keeping to themselves. Dominic decided to go with sorcerer's robes, the ones that the palace had given him, with the royal sorcerer's emblem on them. He had a proper rank now, and he was done with trying to hide who he was just so they wouldn't kick him out of shops. Now that he was looking presentable, Dominic made his way out of the palace and into the noble district outside the gates. The shops were busy first thing in the morning, with servants running errands for the morning's tasks and a few of the earlier rising nobles out doing their shopping. Talk of the war was even more prevalent in the noble district than it was within the palace, and the changes to the deployment orders, which put noblemen among the common soldiers as support, instead of holding them all in reserve, were a major point of contention among the people in the streets during the early morning hours. Dominic stepped into a shop that advertised itself as selling mage tools and magitech accessories, and the conversation followed him inside, along with one of the shop workers who was late arriving. What do you think, Royal Sorcerer, about the nobles being embedded among the common rabble? The shop owner asked. Dominic shrugged. Might do them some good. Having them all together should improve military discipline and coordination. I'm not the foremost expert on the topic, though. I make the weapons, I don't generally use them. The shop owner chuckled, but Dominic didn't miss the disgusted look that the two workers were giving him. Are you not going to volunteer for the Natural Sons Regiment then? One of them asked. Dominic shook his head. Even if they would let me out of the forge, I am the last son of my name and a titled royal sorcerer. I would just end up as the regimental smith to one of the units of Royal Rifles. The worker balanced that information against the fact that Dominic was obviously non-human. He had a point. With a title, his standing was far too high to end up with a relief cavalry unit. Was there anything that we could help you find? The shop owner asked carefully. I was looking for new spells to add to my repertoire. A little treat to celebrate my first few paydays as a royal smith. Dominic explained. The shop owner smiled and sent his workers to the back to begin the morning shelf stocking process. Well now, I have a few things that might be useful to a smith. Some expensive, some not so bad. He explained, then swapped display trays around in one of the cases. The new display was all Magitech-focused spell gems, things that mages would find useful when they took up a craft after graduation. Magical quill, self-drafting blueprint, never-ending ink, clay to steel, magnified sight. Dominic looked at the gems and then gestured to the clay to steel gem. That spell. What quality of steel does it make? He asked. That depends on the level of the spell. If it's level 5 or higher, it will make steel as good as any kitchen knife. If you want the fancy alloys that they use to make Magitech orbs, you'll need it at level 15 or higher. What do you specialize in at the forge?
He asked.
Gunsmithing. Dominic replied. That earned him an approving look from the shopkeeper. Even as an apprentice, a gunsmith was on par with the other Magitech industry workers. But during wartime, they were considerably more valuable to the nation than most others. Chapter 90. Suboptimal Snack Choices. Dominic noted the shopkeeper's impressed expression. It wasn't a secret to him that gunsmiths were well respected anywhere that they went. They weren't a farrier or other trade which was in demand by everyone. The gunsmiths essentially existed to fill the demands of the wealthier noblemen. But he hadn't expected quite as much approval as he was getting. It was a good feeling. Dominic looked at the clay to steel spell. In the wilderness, that would be an incredibly useful spell. But it would also be insanely useful at the forge. If you simply wrapped clay around a rifling rod, you would have a barrel, or you could shape a custom rifle with your fingers instead of the forge. The level of effort needed to work clay was much lower. The shopkeeper saw the deep thought in Dominic's eyes and mistook it as reluctance to part with so much of his first pay. But he knew the trick to overcoming that. Introduce something related but much more expensive, and suddenly the first item looked reasonably priced. So he brought out 2 more items, both Magitech orbs. Orb of Mobile Alchemy Lab. Orb of Pentacle Ward. If you need a safe spot to work, these are the premier items in their category, but if you're willing to work out in the open with your mundane tools, then clay to steel would let you make the rough blanks easily enough. In fact, it is rather popular among the traveling steamsmith journeymen, as clay mud is common at all riverbanks. Dominic smiled. If things get rowdy enough at the forge that I need a protective pentacle, I should probably just call it a day. Besides, I've already got an area barrier. Courtesy of the crown. The shopkeeper chuckled at the success of his tactic. The young sorcerer was definitely buying something today. If he already had the standard military-issued spells for a mage, he was way more wealthy than what they had thought when he first entered, looking so young. Is there a brass or bronze version of the clay to steel spell? You know how folk are about aesthetics. Dominic asked. The shopkeeper nodded. There is, but I do not have it. You see, both are compound alloys, so it takes a more advanced Magitech orb to create them in a multiple-step process. Dominic nodded. Then clay to steel will do wonderfully for my purposes. A bit of artistic expression will be faster with clay than the forge for rough shaping. How much are you asking? Dominic discreetly looked around the room at the items that were on regular display and saw that the prices were mostly in the thousands of gold coins. He might not be able to afford his shopping impulse. 1,500 gold coins, or 50 levels worth of mana cores above level 5, if you prefer a direct trade. The shopkeeper knew that many of the workers liked to sneak mana cores out of the palace, as they were much more valuable than their wages. The penalties were harsh, but the palace didn't force a shopkeeper who obtained one and reported the thief to return the core. Dominic had noticed that the cores from work were all marked, etched with the royal logo. But he didn't carry them around anyhow, much less have any intention of stealing them. Instead, he pulled out 3 level 13 Ogre Source Mana cores and a level 6 Hobgoblin core. The shopkeeper smiled as he saw the cores come out. 5 levels short of the asking price, but definitely close enough for them to make a deal. I can give you 45 levels worth of cores for it, Dominic offered, then waited for the shopkeeper to agree. The gem was taken from the case and handed over. Then they shook hands, and the mage collected his payment. Dominic left, and the 2 assistants came out from the back, shocked at the exchange. He actually had that much money on him? One of them gasped. You haven't seen the way of the world yet. You look down on him for being a demi-human, right? The older mage asked. They both reluctantly nodded. But what you don't realize is that as innocent as he looks with those 2 little gold horns, he could most likely take all 3 of us at once in a fight. If he managed to overcome enough of his bestial nature to be a royal smith, he definitely had enough discipline to collect mana cores and not eat them to fuel his growth. What none of them realized was that Dominic was still standing at the corner of the shop, adding the new spell to his Magitech spellbook. He hadn't ever considered eating a mana core. They didn't look tasty at all. But if that was the way to grow his innate powers, it wouldn't be the most ridiculous thing he ever heard. But he wasn't going to try it now. He would try to find a book on the topic first, in case there was a side effect. Each mana core had impurities based on what sort of creature had formed it. Who knew which ones would be poison? Dominic looked at his spellbook, and then decided that he would touch it up a bit for more utility. The mage shop had said level 5 to make good knife steel from clay. So, Dominic grabbed a pair of stronger mana cores from the ring around his toe and pushed the book up to level 6, and then level 7. The cost was painfully high, as the amount of mana core needed per level doubled every level. But level 7 combat and utility spells would be on par with the lower nobles and the stronger city guards. That was enough for Dominic to feel confident that his area barrier and fireball spells would not be looked down on. But more importantly, he now had a good idea what it would cost to get new spells when he needed them. With that settled, he could spend the rest of the day enjoying the city and browsing the Magitech shops. A hobby of his, and now he could even do it from inside the store, and not just through the windows. These royal sorcerer robes were an overpowered buff to his social status.